But now we do want to, open this up to everyone because we really want to hear from you all. So we want to know, what do you think? I mean, do you know any other tips or advice that you have found helpful when you're writing these sections that you'd maybe like to share? Do you remember seeing a very good practice examples that you'd like to describe? Are there any of these sections that you really do struggle more with writing, or if you're an editor with editing? And what sort of help do you think, what sort of guidance do you think would help with that? And also, if there's any aspect of what we've just discussed that you feel is unclear or you actually disagree with, let's hear about it and we can have a good discussion. So I will open it up now to everyone, and if anyone has anything they want to chip in with.
Nuala, thanks ever so much for that overview of some good practices and challenges in discussion sections. I think it's always interesting to follow the chat. So I've been looking through those. There was quite a bit of chat about the subheadings, and I think in some respects, when you've got a structure like the one that we have in Cochrane Reviews, there's always this tension between how much structure, do you write to the structure or do you write to something else? And I think it's one of the things that I've kind of observed in following that chat, but also more broadly, listening to what you had to say about the content of the discussion sections. I think that structure should really be there to help you write content, to generate content. But I don't think it should determine the entirety of what you write. And I'm sort of answering a question that was posed to me, or posed to us generally, from Faith Armitage at the bottom of the chat, which is about, I think it's about the section that you talked to last, which was about agreements and disagreements. I think in truth, I wouldn't see all the sections as being mandatory as separate headings, but as long as the discussion sections address the things that Nuala's given us a steer on, not least the summary of main results, the applicability of the evidence, how confident we can be in it, what the limitations of our process are, and the context that those findings kind of land in. My aspiration in the long run is that we kind of end up moving away from having subheadings to just having discussion sections that tick all those boxes. I don't know what you think about that, Nuala.
I agree, yeah, because I think people get really stuck in those subheadings and they also think that's the only thing they have to talk about, whereas maybe if it was just a more general open discussion section, but with specific key points that need to be covered, I think that would be a lot more helpful, and I think people would find that easier to follow.
Do you want to just put that last slide up with all those questions on? I'd be interested to hear what people have up their sleeves in terms of tips or advice that you've got for writing these sections. Well, why don't we start with you, Nuala, whilst we're waiting for people to maybe use the chat function.
Yeah.
What tips would you give if you could go back to when you were first starting out on this journey? What would you say?
I feel like people should read other people's discussion sections more often, because I think people get very caught up in the methods and the results of the review, and then all the effort goes into abstract, summary of findings table, the language summary, the conclusions. The discussion section is almost last on a lot of people's lists, so people are just like, just type anything. Whereas, I've seen a lot of really good practice discussion sections in the Cochrane Library. So I do I'll go in the Cochrane Library and I'll look for authors that I'm familiar with, that I know they're going to write a good review. I'll look for their reviews and then look at their discussion sections to see the way, the points they're covering, the way they're structuring it and things like that. I've found that to be quite helpful.
And, thinking about the way that you would write stuff now, I mean, that's useful. That's a useful sort of tip for people to go and read up. But in terms of how would you approach it? You've got that blank space in front of you. How would you tackle it?
I think now, like, this is not something I've done in the past, but it's definitely something I'm going to do next time I do a review. I'm not going to wait until the end to write the discussion section. I think it's actually, as you're working through the review, jot little notes to yourself in that discussion section on the RevMan webpage. You know, like when you make a decision that maybe is contestable, go straight to the discussion section, put in a little note to yourself and potential biases. Remember to talk about this here. And, you know, so rather than waiting until the end and trying to do it all in one swoop, I think it's something that maybe should be thought about the whole way through, and just sort of keep notes on your RevMan webpage. And then when you come to write it up, it'll be a lot more helpful to have it all there ready for you.
That's really good. I mean, I agree. I found that to be really useful. One of the reasons I think it's that particular tip is something I'd really want to emphasize as a sort of as a way to try and tackle this.
Hi, excuse me.
Sure. Yeah. No. Go on. Yeah.
Hi. Can you hear me?
I can. Yeah. Thanks, also.
Hi. Excuse me. So about this question, about this topic, actually, you've put like a tip for writing your discussion that you stop when you have an insight or when you have some process going in your results, that you go to your discussion and write like a note to yourself or like a frame of what your discussion will be. Would you do that directly in the RevMan web, or would you use like a text editor elsewhere, like for safety, so you don't lose your text? How do you use it?
I mean, personally, I would probably do both because I'm a little bit pedantic. So I would probably put something in the RevMan web file, but I'd also probably have a Word document going on my desktop, just reminding me of things like that. I probably don't need the Word document. I do think that RevMan is entirely reliable, but I do understand I probably would want a backup just in case.
Yes, I'm always afraid I'm gonna lose the text or something like that.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Salsa. Yeah, the practicalities of it, I think, may depend on where you are, where you're most comfortable in sort of storing that information. But yeah, I was going to say that essentially that one of the reasons why I think it's such an important bit of advice is because a lot of reviews are really quite complex in terms of structure, and there's so much variability in terms of the amount of information that you're summarizing between comparisons, but also within comparisons. If you think about how much information you might have available for particularly important outcomes in a summary findings table, and that will vary. So there is such sort of it can be quite a daunting task, I think, to try and summarize all of that you need. I actually don't think you could do it without sort of logging some of this stuff as you go. And as Nuala said, with some of those sections which are I think probably the hardest ones to do, which is, in my experience, it's the completeness and applicability and potential biases in the review process, because you can fall back on certain things to say. So you usually see with completeness and applicability how much information there was available, how much meta-analysis you could do, how many studies you had. But actually, that section needs to be. You need to have a slightly broader perspective about that. And as Nuala helpfully said, it's, if you think about framing what you put there in terms of your population intervention, comparison and outcomes, then it becomes less about how much information you had and more about how good the fit was between the evidence you had and what you're interested in. But yeah, really, really good to hear that, Nuala. And in thinking about question 3, what do you struggle with the most? I've given you my top 2.
I do. I think I struggle with potential biases, as does everyone, because no one likes to admit that they were biased or that there were any limitations in the review. You want to think that your review is perfect and it could be replicated by everybody, but you do sometimes struggle trying to think of what decisions might I have been wrong in. So I struggle a little bit with that, but I think that's where the author team comes in, because you're not doing this by yourself. There's a team of people there, so there should be other people there who are more objective and can say, actually, no, this is a contestable decision. You could have made a different decision. Let's reflect on that.
Any other thoughts or comments from the from our participants this afternoon?
Well, I think it's helpful, while one needs to address all of these issues, let's address them in a really concise fashion and not feel that discussion has to go on for pages and pages and pages and pages.
Mhm.
Let's just keep it focused. And it's not, you don't get extra credit for thinking of absolutely every single reason under the sun why something might have been as it was. And, let's just, deal with the bigger things and leave the tiny bits, just leave them out.
Discipline is a real skill, I think, and there are many skills that people need when they're doing research, and certainly they need it when they're doing systematic reviews. But I think a common strand across all forms of biomedical research and publishing is the sort of the unpolished and the least refined skill of all, which is writing. And that, I think, is your point is really well made, Elizabeth. That sort of the bloated scope that you can find with some discussion sections can also reflect the fact that the review itself, the review that you're writing up, has a particularly broad scope. So I often think that if you may be struggling to fit everything in, as you've indicated might be an issue sometimes, it's worth going back and looking at the sort of how broad your PICO was. How many summary findings tables did you end up doing versus how many did you really need to address the review objectives? But if you, I think trying to kind of keep it to a sort of a nice flow. Structure helps, but you don't have to fill everything out, I guess, is the key thing there.
Hi there. And sort of following on from that point, I've often find it tricky in the summaries, editing or writing when there are a lot of comparisons. So it's trying to decide what you can legitimately cut out, because a lot of that information is presumably not presented in the summary of findings tables, because we're already limiting ourselves to what have been decided as the most important to show. But it's not to say that other comparisons are not also clinically relevant. So it's very tricky to summarize a vast amount of information and decide what should or shouldn't be there, because as you've already said, the reviews themselves can carry such a lot of information. If you're not going to have it in the summary of findings table or even in the discussion, it might be lost altogether. So I'd just be interested in your thoughts on that. And also, if this review includes non-inferiority studies, have you any examples or thoughts on how best to present or summarize evidence from those?
I'll be honest, honestly, I don't actually have much advice about the non-inferiority studies. It's not something I know enough about, I'm afraid. As for when there's large numbers of comparisons and outcomes, I mean, it's such a struggle. And I've seen really, really lengthy discussion sections because they're trying to cover everything, and it's so hard to prioritize. I mean, it is something that it's hard to do, but it's not impossible. We can all prioritize. And another thing I think is important to consider is, if it's that hard to prioritize, is this review too bloated? Like, I think a lot of people do ask research questions that are just too wide because they're trying to cover everything. And if you're really struggling to summarize all of your comparisons and all of your outcomes, it might be because you were trying to answer too big a question to begin with. So I know that doesn't help when it comes to the discussion section because you're at the very end of the process. But again, it's another reason why at the start of the process, when you're defining your research question, keep it specific and concise, because there's so many reasons why it does just lead to trouble further on down the line.
Yeah, I think the discussion section is possibly too late to discover that you've got too many comparisons. But I think there are sort of moments, I think, in the life of the review where you can sort of do a sanity check or a scope check, and it's not just one when you're putting the review together. I actually think during the sort of the protocol development phase, it's worth trying to think through what sort of comparisons, what sets of comparisons are you committing yourself to, or are the authors committing themselves to, and actually what would be the most useful comparison to address the overarching kind of review question. And maybe for some reviews, you're always chasing your tail a bit, you're always sort of behind a bit, because if you know, it's an interventions for kind of exercise, which from an authoring perspective and an editing perspective, and Elizabeth, I know you're on the call, Faith, I know you're on the call as well, but I suspect from an editing perspective that presents particular challenges, because often that's where the kind of you're almost inviting a kind of a broad, you're deliberately going broad on interventions, and at some point in the future those reviews probably need to transition to something a bit more focused, a bit more targeted. But I think just coming back a bit, Catherine, to the question that you had, I think it's quite an important exercise. The reason why I think it's important to prioritize is because you've got to have a manageable review, and that's not just sort of for that initial that first version. That review's got to potentially be updated. So it's good. There has to be some sustainability to that, to the focus of that review in the long term. You had a question about non-inferiority trials as well. I mean, I know that there are analytical questions which are possibly distinct for non-inferiority versus superiority trials, but I don't necessarily see the challenges with putting together discussion sections to be too different. I guess the methodological considerations, you obviously don't just deal with them in the method section and the analyses. You'd also be thinking about sort of some of the interpretation elements as well. Some of those things will definitely come into the discussion section, but I would my general sort of view on life is that a lot of the challenges you hit with I mean, I'll say intervention discussion sections because that was obviously the focus of many of the examples that you were drawn, but a lot across many kind of reviews that Cochrane has published. I think a lot of the challenges with write-up are actually generic. They're not specific to different study designs or even review types.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, the prioritizing, definitely, I agree. I guess it gets trickier. I think it's especially with updates when just techniques have evolved. But yeah, that it's a balance between giving clinicians the whole picture and prioritizing, as you say. But I get it. It's just a decision to be made.
Yes, I mean, yeah, and I think you can make that decision. I'll be daring and say after the protocol, but I think you there are times when you're going to know that actually this is just a list of interventions, and even if they've all got some merit, some will have more merit than others, I think, and I think it's worth starting there and then working out where you might want to just stop. And I've been involved in reviews where we've had this sort of long list of interventions and realized, I think, that actually what we were dealing with was for some sort of therapeutic approaches, we've got quite a kind of a heavy weight of evidence, and for others it was just sort of they were at an earlier point in their life cycle. So although they had some relevance, actually we didn't have to worry too much about them yet. So in grade terms, very low certainty evidence, small early phase studies, basically. And in time that picture may change, but we sort of could keep a focus that was sort of tracked closely to what the kind of priorities were in practice for that area, but noted that these were sort of areas to watch for in the longer run.
In the future. Okay,
Yep.
Great, thank you.
So, it's Ruthie, might you advocate in that case for selecting your summary findings tables, for example, on the basis of the certainty of the evidence?
Neela, what do you think of that?
It depends on the research area and the research question. My general feeling is probably not, because if it's a really important comparison and a really important outcome, and there's only low certainty evidence available, that's a very important finding to flag to the decision makers. You know, they need to know that this incredibly important outcome only has low certainty evidence about it. We need to do something about that. But I mean, again, there's no right or wrong decision here. Like, you do have to think about your research question, the decision makers that you're writing for, and what they genuinely will find the most useful.
The care, I think, I stress with that is you don't necessarily, you know, being led by certainty isn't the same as being led by priority. So I'd always kind of default to priority over certainty. But actually, Ruth, one of that question you've asked reminds me of some of the issues that we see with network meta-analyses, where actually, you know, the selection of, you haven't so much got an issue of selection of comparisons, but you may well end up with a situation where you've got to try and squeeze many nodes. You know, if you think about how big some networks are, you've got to squeeze many nodes into one kind of structured reporting format, and that isn't straightforward. But I think we had an NMA reporting clinic, I think, a while back. But it might be worth looking at that, see how they focus the attention on that particular bit of the review.
Yeah, I can think of reviews, you know, sort of, I realise it can't be a one size fits all thing, but I can think of reviews where, you know, the person reading it might want to see amidst all the comparisons where anything can be known.
Right. Yeah.
But I take that.
As a rule, I think I'd be quite skeptical about it but I think your sort of reader interest, I think, may well make it a different exercise. Maybe that's something that's in time with scoping reviews. If we get a kind of a version of grade that kind of fits scoping or some way of sort of doing that might be a direction to consider. Okay, I think we may well have reached the end of the line with this. I think there's been some really nice comments and questions that have come in the chat, and also thank you to Celso, Ruth, Catherine, for the questions and the discussion. Neela, however, I think deserves the greatest amount of gratitude from me this afternoon, because she's put together such a fantastic presentation and been able to share her experience and her thoughts with us about what I'm sure you will agree is a never a dull bit, or it shouldn't be a dull bit. If it's dull, come back and look at this presentation and get some tips on writing more interesting discussion sections. All right. Thanks everybody for coming along this afternoon. It was great to see you all, and take care, and see you at the next event. Thank you, Neela. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.